mean, oh, thank you, Gargi. One of the things I really included also when I did my dissertation some years ago, it was actually storytelling, and I just loved it. I used like storytelling circles, and it was just so life giving. So that's one of the reasons I'm so excited, Vivian. So it's all yours. Welcome. Thank you.
All right, let me share my screen here. Oh, it says I'm not able to share screen.
Sorry, I meant to, let me find you here. I'm making co-host. There you go.
Okay. Okay, well, disclaimer from me, first of all, I am not an expert in presenting anything, but I will make sure that I present the information in a way that will appeal to all types of learners. So there'll be something auditory, of course, from what I'm saying, but something also visual. So there will be short videos as well, so that you can listen to some videos directly from the voices of some of the experts in the field, short videos. And then also some of the kinetic learners will have something to be able to write down. So hopefully I appeal to all kinds of learners. So let me start by thanking all of you for taking the time to attend this presentation on stories and storytelling in leadership and research. This topic has a place and relevance in my past, my present, and my future. So I grew up listening to stories told by my grandmother. And we didn't have television, smartphones, computer games, or any other form of entertainment. So we were playing outside mostly. And if we're not playing outside, we're just outside. And my grandmother will be telling us different stories, usually stories of the animal kingdom, or all kinds of other stories of the past. And I learned a lot from those stories. They were some of the most enjoyable moments I remember from back home. And in the present, I found that coming to America in my teenage years, my skin color meant that society had already decided what my story should be. And so I spent a long time finding my authentic voice and telling my story so that people could see me as a unique being. In the future, the use of stories will feature heavily in my dissertation because of my method I have chosen to use. So I'll say more about that later. So this is a brief overview of the talk. Be a little bit about my history, my story, and then I'll talk about the importance of storytelling, the role of storytelling and stories in leadership, and the role of stories and storytelling in research. I will invite you to maybe have a piece of paper or a pen where at the end of the talk, you can kind of look back and think back at everything that was said, and then consider from the talk, what information that resonated most with you, maybe what was surprising, what wasn't surprising, and how you feel about telling your story. And have you felt comfortable telling your story? Not just the good parts, the aces, but also the bits where you feel like those failures can also help somebody else. So I will ask you again at the end. I will invite you to share that. So I want to break out rooms so that everybody would be able to hear what it is you have to say. So if you are willing at that point, you just use the hand raise emoji for that. Right. So this is my family. I am the first of 5, so I'm the oldest of 5 children. They are all a good foot taller than I am, but I am the only one without any gray hairs. So as far as I'm concerned, this means that there's justice in the world. I am also originally from Nigeria in West Africa. Nigeria is about 6 times the size of Georgia, and slightly more than twice the size of California. And I was born in Benin City, which is all the way to the bottom there in the called Edo State in Benin City. I was born there. And then when I was about 5 months old, we moved to the UK. So I only came back to Nigeria during the time for primary and secondary school, which you would call maybe junior high and senior high over here. Nigeria has the largest population of any African nation. So it's about 231 million people and growing because of the high birth rate. So fun fact, Nigeria actually has the highest rate of twin births per year. Let me show you that again. It has the highest rate of twin births per year. And we have more than 250 ethnic groups. And about 56% of that population are between the ages of 15 and 64. But most of them are unemployed because unemployment rate is really high. English is the official language, but we have over 500 indigenous languages. So in terms of religion, about 53% of Nigeria is Muslim and 10% Catholic. 35% would be other Christian denominations, and then 1% would be like pre-Christian practices. It doesn't snow in Nigeria, but we do have periods of drought and flooding. I never experienced the drought, but the floodings in Nigeria are epic. This is our banknote. So if you want to know what our currency looks like, so this is about 200 Naira, which the equivalent of that in dollars is pretty much 43 cents. So we rank number 3 on the most populated country in the world, about 231 million. This is our flag. It's very plain, of green, white, and green. Because we have 250 ethnic groups, they didn't want any particular group to think that they were left out. So it's very simple. And the green represents our agricultural industry, and the white, the peace and unity that we strive for always. And before I start this, one more fun fact about Nigeria is that we have the second largest in the world by volume movie production industry. And it's nicknamed Nollywood. So, not very original, but we have a very large movie industry in Nigeria. So that's some brief information about my home country, because this is part of my story as well. Our stories begin with our names. And the name that I'm giving represents a lot of things in our lives, and it also signifies who you will be. And that's why naming is very important in my culture. So our stories begin with our name. So for example, my name, Vivian, means alive or life or lively. And then my middle name, Idevo, which is my Nigerian name, means no one can change my destiny but God. Those names are quite important. And also in Nigeria, English name is first and our native names are second. And that's just a product of colonialism. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about my name in relation to my story, because my name has become my mantra for my life story. It means to go out and live my life knowing that no one can change my destiny but God. So I encourage you to look at the meaning of your name. Maybe ask your parents why they gave you that name, or maybe kind of use that to kind of start your story. It is believed that the naming of a child significantly impacts their personality and character. It affects their self-esteem, their confidence, and their sense of self. This is because your name is often the first thing that others learn about you. And our names can shape how we perceive, how we are perceived, and sometimes how others even treat us. So even when people apply for something, the name already tells people all kinds of things, whether they have false assumptions or stereotypes. So your name is very important. That affects self-worth, self-esteem, and how you carry yourself, which will eventually affect your leadership style and your leadership philosophy. It will affect how people respond to you as a leader, how you say your name, how you introduce yourself. I am part of cohort 46. Most of them graduated this year, and I'm super proud of all of them. My cohort taught me two things. First, that it's okay to be vulnerable. And second, that everyone has something of value to bring to the table. All voices can and should be heard. These are concepts that have been contributing to my personal and professional development, and are also powerful concepts in leadership. So cohort 46 has become part of my story, the story I tell about my leadership journey. So what are stories? Well, researcher, author, Dr. Kim defines a story as a detailed organization of narrative events arranged in a structure based on time, although the events are not necessarily in chronological order. So stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. Stories are subject to interpretation, and they usually have some sort of self-reflective dimension to them. There is always more than one story. And our lives and cultures are composed of many overlapping stories. But there is a problem. Most of the time, people and countries are seen through the lens of a singular story. And usually the one others have chosen for us, the ones other people want to believe, and the ones societies have created over time based on assumptions and misconceptions. But when we do this, we risk misunderstandings, insensitivity, and we miss an opportunity to encounter a person as a whole being and know a different culture and country in a refreshing way. I will play a video about why Africa, the continent of Africa, tells stories. And we'll hear from some of the experts in Africa of why they tell stories and why storytelling is important in Africa.
Greetings. In this video, we will be discussing Intsomi folk tales. No African can say they don't know about these types of tales because they have been told for eons. We must ask ourselves, why were Intsomi told? Who told them? When and how? We know Intsomi were told, and in the village of yesteryear, this was the ritual in every home. At sunset, when the kids were done with their chores and done with playing, and the sun was setting, the mothers would prepare the cooking pots for supper. The grannies and others who felt like it would gather the little ones around the fire and tell these tales. All around the village, from home to home around the early evening fires, often in the courtyard before the huts, the animal kraals behind them, you could see the solemn gatherings, little ones of all ages huddled eagerly around the fires, eyes agog, listening with all their might as the teller spun her tale. That was the scene, certainly, of a summer's early evening. In winter, of course, the scene moved indoors. But even then, it was around the fire and therefore in the hut where the cooking was done. So the fireside warmth and the heartfelt fire of story go together. Evening, always evening. In this video, we will hear a few of my esteemed colleagues share their thoughts on this most important aspect of our cultural heritage, Intsomi folk tales. Each will tell us why they chose to become a storyteller.
It was a happy home because of the stories. I remember all the good times we shared with, we were only two from my parents, my late brother and myself. But because of stories, I didn't know that the other people around us were not my real brothers and sisters. Because there was always fun and laughter, there was always something to talk about. It was a joyous home because my grandmother obviously had this technique to keep us happy and together. So I would say my first memory that comes is unity and fun and happiness that comes when you know that there are people I'm going back to at home who are going to be sharing a story and we are going to be seated and laughing about something.
I've been involved with storytelling now for some time. The reason for that, because storytelling has been part of us since back in centuries. You will remember that our grandfathers and grandmothers used to sit us around the fire telling us stories, because you will know that our history has not been recorded, in writing. It's been passed to generation through storytelling. We used to call it intsomi. So, and also it's an easy way to narrate a message to your children. So also, I've been doing this in part of promoting literacy education in our schools. That's the reason that I've been involved with storytelling.
I think storytelling is very, very important in all the nations, in all the countries, to almost everyone under the sun. Why am I saying so? Storytelling is vital. It plays a major role in conversations that are happening in the country. It doesn't matter whether we're talking history, we're talking geography, we're talking science, but as long as the storytelling is involved.
So after 2 years as a teacher, so I was one of the assistant librarians that was working at the library. That is when Dr. Pina conducted some workshops on storytelling, and she spotted me there when I told a story of 3 sisters, 1-eyed, 2 eyes, and 3 eyes. And maybe because my eyes are big, I used to roll these eyes of mine. And then that is when she discovered that I'm a storyteller. Then from then, I had that passion of storytelling.
I started becoming a storyteller while I was still young. At school, I was a tiny child, and I used not to have shoes at school. Even my uniform was always broken and all that stuff. So other kids used to bully me and telling me that I'm ugly and all those kind of stuff. And my way of fitting in, I would always bring stories to them, tell them stories, tell them jokes. They would laugh so that they can love me.
To stories well told, everybody listened, both the young and the old. In the olden days, this was an enjoyable time and people laughed, enjoying the warm sense of togetherness of an evening. These tales were not told during the day. Indeed, it was said that anyone who did that
Everything about us, everything about being an African and preserving who you are and what you are in society.
So storytelling is very, very important, not only for children. People can learn empathy because of storytelling. People can learn how to hold a positive conversation. Nations can learn to forgive one another because of storytelling. And storytelling, even if maybe there is a family feud, the family nucleus is not 100%, people are not getting along inside the family structure, but through stories, it's like a cement, it can unite families. And if it unites families, it unites communities. If it unites communities, it unites the nations. That's storytelling.
Wow. And we as a nation need that cement. We need unity. We need nation building. We need forgiveness. If stories in Tsomi can help us achieve this so important and much needed aspect of our nation, why? Let us unleash storytellers on the whole land. Let Intsomi be told throughout South Africa to help us towards forgiveness and peace, things we so desperately need, to say nothing of unity. Thank you, Mr. Ntlakuse, for reminding us of the power of Intsomi. Long before the watch came, traditional peoples the world over, not only in Africa but the world through, understood routine, order, and its importance in life and living. And they used Intsomi to ensure that routine was observed. But surely there was something else to Intsomi. There was a bigger reason. Children were not told, hey, we tell you these tales because we want to teach you respect and manners. No. But nonetheless, tales were an integral part of educating young kids of AmaXhosa, teaching them Ubuntu, what it means to be human, or how life is lived, etiquette, etc. It was through these tales that people from an early age learned the community's do's and don'ts, what one was permitted to do and what one was not permitted to do, what was forbidden and what was taboo. Intsomi taught a person what was expected of them. This means these tales are always a part of raising kids, socializing them, and teach them their cultural identity. The child grows up knowing the pillars and regulations of his community and how to live with others. I'm sure you will agree with me when I say, as my esteemed colleagues have said, storytelling is vital to our living. This was so in the past, it is so today. But
So that's a little bit about why storytelling is important in my culture. Let's listen to another expert talking about storytelling.
Despite being one of the most ancient of human rituals, storytelling is an underutilized leadership tool in many organizations today. This is despite the evidence that shows that stories are better remembered by listeners than raw facts alone. In addition, stories can be an effective mechanism for triggering emotions in an audience, and emotions are known to play a critical role in human decision-making and action. And finally, by using a personal story, a leader can create vulnerability and intimacy, allowing for a deeper connection with others. So how do you tell a story in the workplace that moves others to act? Marshall Gans, the activist, grassroots campaigner and academic at Harvard University, offers a three-part storytelling structure. First, there's the story of self. This is the personal story that outlines your personal choice points, your actions, and your values. The personal story helps your audience answer the question, why should I follow you? Second, the story of us. This is the story of the shared narrative and common values that connects the audience together and ties the audience to the storyteller. It helps your audience answer the question, how does my story relate to yours? And finally, the story of now. This is the choice, the challenge, the call to action. This helps answer the audience question, what do I need to do now? In today's busy world, where we are overwhelmed with information, stories can cut through the noise and help your team focus on what's essential. So, what's holding you back from telling a story that moves others to action? For this and other perspectives on growing your leadership, please visit www.think.org.
Those are two videos talking about why storytelling is important, why stories are important. And I know for me culturally, it is the way that our parents and my grandparents always kind of told us about our culture, because that culture is passed down from generation to generation. And it is rarely written down, but it's told in story form. It's also used to kind of give us some life lessons on when we're doing something wrong, just as the elders were saying. Okay. Right. Storytelling and leadership through the lens of the Jesuit values. First of all, storytelling in leadership practice can be used to develop deeper connections with those we lead, trust, and those we have empathy for. It facilitates understanding, and it places value on the uniqueness of individual life journeys. Telling your story is of value because it contributes to your personal development as a leader. It is empowering and therapeutic. It allows for an understanding of one's values and a reevaluation of one's beliefs and assumptions, which may even alter your leadership philosophy and your leadership style. This telling stories elevates leadership effectiveness when launching a vision, strategic planning, persuading others, communicating identity, motivating others, and even controlling rumors. Storytelling could also be used for knowledge sharing, learning, and even facilitating unlearning. This can be used for fostering cultural exchange. To be an effective leader, credibility must be built. Telling a compelling story is one way to build credibility. Stories can facilitate change in an organization, inform policy, and can highlight the voices of the marginalized. But from the lens of Jesuit values, lifting up the stories that propel change for the betterment of humanity, listening to the stories that inspire or inform, as well as telling our personal stories, are ways to embody fully some of the Jesuit values. So as a student attending a Jesuit institution and a member of Alpha Sigma Nu, I have been enjoying incorporating the Jesuit values in my research and my writing. I have also been enjoying spotting them when they are hiding in plain sight in the stories of others that have changed the world, stories that have changed the world. And in those stories, some of those stories I will share with you right now. Most of them you already know and you've heard of these people. The Jesuit value of forming and educating agents of change can be recognized, first of all, in the story of Irena Sandler. When she was 29 years old, she was a Polish social worker. She was known for doing the right thing even when it was hard. She rescued frightened Jews during the Nazi invasion. The horror of the times formed and educated her to become an agent of change. This particular story is a story of courage and integrity. Rosa Parks. On December 1st, 1955, after a long day, she got on a bus, sat wherever she felt like, and when the bus was full, she was asked to give up her seat to a white passenger. As the law in Alabama at the time required her to get up from her seat when the bus was full to make way for white passengers. But she refused, and then she was arrested for civil disobedience. Her defiance led to her arrest, and her arrest sparked a 381-day boycott of the Montgomery bus system, which was one of the pivotal moments in the civil rights movement. Through remembering her self-worth and challenging the status quo, she began forming as an agent of change. Her action formed and educated others to also be agents of change. It led to a 1956 Supreme Court decision banning segregation on public transportation. She was an agent of change. This particular story is a story of challenging the status quo and knowing your worth. Lois Gibbs. In 1978, Lois Gibbs wondered why her children and her neighbors were all having unusual health problems. She discovered that their neighborhood sat on top of 21,000 tons of buried chemical waste. Without any hesitation, she organized her neighbors and led her community into a battle against the local, state, and federal government. And after some years, more than 800 families were evacuated and the cleanup of that neighborhood began. Her desire for justice and her refusal to remain silent or ignore environmental problems formed her to be an agent of change. And she inspired an entire community to engage and fight, forming others and educating them also to be agents of change. Misty Copeland. Misty Copeland. Her story inspires gifted women of color to try out ballet, which at the time was said to be only for rich girls who were not of color. Her contribution to classical ballet helped diversify the art form. And in the fall of 2014, she made history as the first Black woman to perform the lead role of Odette and Odile in American Ballet Theatre, Swan Lake, during the company's inaugural tour of Australia. And in June 2015, Misty was promoted to principal dancer, which made her the first African-American woman to ever be promoted to the position to that position in the company in 75 years. She has not been afraid to strive for more or excellence. She represents Magis. And then we have Malala Yousafzai. She learned about the importance of education from her father. But when the Taliban took control of her hometown in 2008, they prohibited girls from going to school. She spoke out and she was shot on the left side of her head. After her recovery, she spoke out even louder. And then there was change. She became an agent of change. And her story formed and educated others to change. This particular story is a story of barriers becoming opportunity. The Jesuit value of being persons for and with others can be recognized in the story of Donald Stratton, an American sailor that tells of his firsthand account of Pearl Harbor, the attack at Pearl Harbor, and how his fight to return. It is an intimate and unforgettable eyewitness account, which he shares in his memoirs. And he tells us why he decided to tell his story. At this point in his life, he said, "It has been said that when an old person dies, it is like a library burning down. For the past 75 years, I have tried to share what I remember of World War II, but a day will come when I can no longer speak. Then what will become of everything I experienced on December 7, 1941? That's why I wrote down my story, my account of what happened. I want to save from that fire something of my memories of the Arizona 75 years ago, so that my grandkids and all the children after them can understand why it matters." Here is a very brief clip of Donald Stratton as he tells part of his story in his own voice.
And Sunday morning was just like about every other Sunday morning. Had reveille and we had chow and picked up some oranges in my white hat to take to a buddy in sick bay. And I came back out on the deck there and some sailors were hollering and pointing. And we seen one of the aircraft take a dip and turn around and sees a big fireball on there, and we knew it was the Japanese, or I did anyway. Got to my battle station and we got preparation for, started firing at some of the planes that were coming over, but vessel was in our way. We couldn't fire back the other way because we train around too far, we're going to hit the superstructure of our own ship. But the big bomb that hit went right down beside number 2 turret on the starboard side, right into 1 million pounds of ammunition that exploded. There was no escape there down the hatches or down the ladders and everything, because everything was all so hot you couldn't hardly do anything. And one gentleman jumped out and I tried to close the hatch and got burned pretty bad, but just pulled the skin off my arms and threw it down because it was in the way. Joe George on the, we found out his name later, on board the vessel, and he got it, so there's a heaver line, which is just a small 9-thread line, and it pulled a big, larger line across and tied it off on the Arizona and started to go hand over hand across that line. Everybody was there. People were laying on the deck. People were groaning and hollering and screaming. Everybody was trying to get a shot of morphine, and my t-shirt caught on fire, and of course they cut all of our clothes off. And my back was burnt pretty bad. All my hair was gone, burned off. Part of my ear was gone, and had a lot of scars. When I was discharged the first time, I went home. Nobody was around. All the people I graduated with, that I ran around with, they were all in the service. And that's probably had a lot to do with me going back. Outside maybe a little revenge. The people that sacrificed their lives that day are still there, and they're still heroes.
That was Donald Stratton telling his story in his voice. Each time I mention someone, so if possible, I usually would like to, I show some clip of them so that they can tell what it is that they know in their voice. That is part of the idea of storytelling. It's about voice. And so that's why you see the video clips of those different people. Instead of me just pointing and saying, in this YouTube video, this person said that, this article, this person said that, I am showing you the video and so that you can hear their stories in their own voices. So that was Donald Stratton's story, which he only started to tell late in his life because he realized there'll be a time he won't be able to remember. And how unfortunate would that be if they don't remember, and his grandchildren and children after that don't remember. So storytelling, there is a science behind it. And the science is that when we hear a story, something happens in our brains. Oxytocin gets released. Oxytocin is a feel-good hormone that gets produced by the brain when we hear a story to which we identify with or that resonates with us. And when oxytocin is released in the brain, people feel connection, they feel empathy. and are motivated to pro-social acts. This is good news for leaders and also prompts them to be able to tell the stories, the right stories in their organization. So research has shown that oxytocin enhances the effects of charismatic leaders in groups. Charismatic leaders have a tremendous effect on people for good or bad. Charismatic leaders use verbal and nonverbal signaling, which forms profound emotional bonds with followers. Oxytocin enhances the effect of signaling. It also increases perception of charisma. People are more likely to mimic the leader or to express positive affect. Oxytocin goes beyond just that part of which it's used for, which is the parent-child relationship connection. It goes beyond that to bonding process and further explains the leader-follower relationship in terms of bonding and rapport. It is associated with trustworthiness. At the end of the slides, I have all of the references of where I'm getting all of this information from as well, in case you wanted to further look at information. So compelling narratives cause oxytocin to be released, dopamine to be released, and they have a positive effect on the person, or sometimes even a negative effect, because if a person is wound up by whatever a leader said and it really resonated with them, it can prompt them to also negative actions, to violence as well. Also, it also increases maybe attachment to a specific leader, even in church, an attachment to a particular priest. Because they identify so much with what they say, there's bonding that happens and trust to anything that they say. Compelling narratives cause oxytocin to be released. And so they affect our attitudes, our beliefs, and our behavior. Current research also links oxytocin to prompting virtuous behaviors. Let's listen to another expert.
There's a Native American proverb that says, "The one who tells the story rules the world." Stories have the potential to be incredibly powerful. They're able to change how we relate to each other, to change prejudice. So the potential for stories to persuade is staggering. I read this really good research paper about these two books, which basically suggested that if you get people to read a couple of chapters of Harry Potter, they'll rate themselves higher than other people in their ability to potentially move something just using the power of their mind. The people who read about the vampires, they'll actually believe that their teeth are slightly longer than other people in the population, just as a result of having read a chapter or two of this book. In terms of psychology, there's a few things that stories actually do to us. We get this sense that we're fully immersed in the world that we're reading about.
Would you like to come on an adventure?
And we start to almost feel as if the things that are happening to them are happening to us.
Reading is not a relaxation. You are building worlds. You are populating those worlds with cities, and those cities you are populating with people. So although television, film, theatre all have their place in the storytelling world, to me that moment of contact with a book, when you read a story and unlock its secrets, nothing quite comes close.
Our research has been on the meaning of individual words. If you read the word jump, for example, you activate those areas that you also activate when you do actually perform the action of jumping. So that would be about here somewhere. The interesting question in this case, of course, is, I mean, if you read about somebody else jumping, why should you activate brain areas related to jumping? The proponents of the theory would say that immersing yourself into a story is based on the mirror neuron system. I am convinced that mirror neurons are part of this process, but it can't be the whole story.
It's been found that when we connect with people who aren't real but are fictional characters, it forms a sort of social surrogate for us. It's almost like they're a real person when they're not. And psychologists sometimes call it forming a parasocial relationship. And what's interesting about that is it kind of makes us feel less lonely, and it can also buffer self-esteem and improve our mood. We know that having a lot of friendships with other people when you're in a couple is a really positive thing for the outcomes of that relationship. But what's really interesting is they don't have to be real people. If you're trying to change people's opinions about controversial topics such as same-sex marriage or immigration, for example, stories have actually been found to be a lot more effective in producing political change. Attitudes towards stigmatised groups could be improved by reading Harry Potter, but only if the person identified with Harry.
Children love stories. They always have a story to tell, whether it's about the weekend or what happened in the playground. And it's such an important part of understanding the world around them and understanding themselves.
You should definitely turn this off right now and go and pick up a book.
So that was some information about the science behind storytelling and how stories kind of prompt us to do a lot of things, which is a very useful tool for leaders. Because if you know how a story impacts the people that you are leading, you will tell better stories, you will tell more relevant stories, you will tell the stories that motivate and inspire and that shift them forward. Another expert, briefly.
I found that no matter people's gender or their generation or their geography in the world, the stories resonated and worked. But in my work with leaders, I've also found they tend to be allergic to telling stories. They're not sure where to find them, or they're not sure how to tell them, or they think they have to present data and that there's just not room to tell story. And that's where I want to focus today, because storytelling and data is actually not this either or. It's an and. They actually create this power ballad that connects you to information differently. To understand how, we have to first understand what happens neurologically when you're listening to a story and data. So as you're in a lecture or you're in a meeting, two small parts of your brain are activated. Wernicke and Broca's area. This is where you're processing information, and it's also why you tend to forget 50% of it right after you hear it. When you listen to a story, your entire brain starts to light up. Each of your lobes will light up as your senses and your emotions are engaged. As I talk about a phone falling and hitting the ground with a thud, your occipital and your temporal lobes are lighting up as though you were actually seeing that fall phone and hearing it hit with a thud. There's this term, neural coupling, which says, as the listener, your brain will light up exactly as mine as the storyteller. It mirrors this activity as though you are actually experiencing these things. Storytelling gives you this artificial reality. If I talk to you about like walking through the snow, and with each step, the snow is crunching under my shoes, and big wet flakes are falling on my cheeks, your brains are now lighting up as though you are walking through the snow and experiencing these things. It's why you can sit in an action movie and not be moving, but your heart is racing as though you are the star on screen, because this neural coupling has your brain lighting up as though you were having that activity. As you listen to stories, you automatically gain empathy for the storyteller. The more empathy you experience, the more oxytocin is released in your brain. Oxytocin is the feel-good chemical, and the more oxytocin you have, the more trustworthy you actually view the speaker. This is why storytelling is such a critical skill for a leader because the very act of telling a story makes people trust you more. As you begin to listen to data, some different things happen. There are some misconceptions to understand. And the first is that data doesn't change our behavior, emotions do. If data changed our behavior, we would all sleep 8 hours and exercise and floss daily and drink 8 glasses of water, but that's not how we actually decide. Neuroscientists have studied decision-making, and it starts in our amygdala. This is our emotional epicenter where we have the ability to experience emotions, and it's here at a subconscious level where we begin to decide. We make choices to pursue pleasure or to avoid risk, all before we become aware of it. At the point we become aware, where it comes to the conscious level, we start to apply rationalization and logic, which is why we think we're making these rationally based decisions, not realizing that they were already decided in our subconscious. Antonio Damasio is a neuroscientist that started to study patients that had damage to their amygdala, fully functioning in every way except they could not experience emotions. And as a result, they could not make decisions. Something as simple as, do I go this way or this way? They were incapable of doing because they could not experience emotions. These were people that were wildly successful before they had the damage to their amygdala, and now they couldn't complete any of their projects, and their careers took big hits, all because they couldn't experience emotions where we decide. Another data misconception. Data never speaks for itself. Our brains love to anticipate, and as we anticipate, we fill in the gaps on what we're seeing or hearing with our own knowledge and experience and our own bias, which means my understanding of data is going to differ from yours, and it's going to differ from yours because we're all going to have our own interpretation if there isn't a way to guide us through. Now, I'm not suggesting that data's bad and story's good. They both play a key role. And to understand how, you have to see what makes a great story. It's going to answer 3 questions. The first is, what is the context? Meaning, what's the setting? Who's involved? Why should I even care? What is the conflict? Where is that moment where everything changes? And what is the outcome?
Let us hear from
Store. You know, the one, the normal grocery store that you go to. Imagine walking through the front door and going over to the fruits and vegetables section, and there you see a pile of lemons. Lemons on sale. A big, nice pile of bright, yellow, juicy, ripe lemons. And in front of that pile of lemons is a tray of lemon wedges for you to sample. And there's a little sign that says, take one. You grab one of these lemon wedges, you bring it up to your nose, and you smell it. There's a fresh lemon. Now you bring that lemon wedge down to your mouth and you take a bite. Ooh, and you feel that juice go into your mouth and you get that little tingle across your face. You guys should see your faces right now. You all have lemon face. You look ridiculous. Okay, now open your eyes. Raise your hand now if you are salivating. Now, isn't that cool? You had a physical reaction to a story. So why do leaders tell stories? Stories have the power to connect emotionally. They have the power to project images into the mind of the listener. Leaders tell stories to deliver their idea more effectively. Think of a story as something you can wrap around an idea to deliver it in a way that engages and resonates with the listener. What's the job of the leader? It's to help us go from where we are to where we want to be, and the leader presents an idea wrapped in a story.
Those were the experts talking about why storytelling is important and the science behind storytelling. So it's not just about telling stories, but there's actually an effect that happens. Now, what makes an effective storyteller in leadership? The acronym you see in front of you. To maximize your storytelling power, remember this acronym. S, solve a problem. The story should solve a problem. Use your story to answer a question that your audience or listeners have been thinking about or already voiced. Or like in research, a question of interest to solve a wicked problem. Triumph. Whatever happens, make sure that the end gives a feeling of hope, or even it ends on a positive note. This will always capture the hearts of the readers. If nothing else, the triumph should be that there is hope to do something with your research work. Outcome. Consider what you are trying to achieve by telling a particular story. And research. With the right research, you can tailor your story or narrative to be audience specific. The kind of story you tell usually is determined by the audience. So you can't tell stories that the audience will look at you and not know what you're talking about or not understand. And then using your own personal stories where possible makes your intention more believable and your audience pay more attention to you. It also helps lighten the mood if it's also a topic that is difficult or a situation that is difficult in a workplace. Even one that illustrates your personal challenges or your personal failures can be somewhat of a lesson for others. Choose your stories wisely. Now, the role of stories and storytelling in research. Researchers have two jobs: answering interesting questions and telling the story. If researchers want their insights to influence leadership research and practice, then it will be prudent to add an additional step after identifying and answering interesting questions. It might be useful to utilize art and science. It might be useful to utilize the art and science of storytelling and the craft of writing relevant stories. This applies to both quantitative and qualitative researchers. So one obstacle to effective storytelling in research is the need to remove the human face of the participants and engage in just the extrapolated themes in order to sound as scholarly as possible. So now I'm not saying that research should just be about stories and that we should be waxing poetic while conducting academic research. I am saying that even if research doesn't bring tears to people's eyes or doesn't release any feel-good neurotransmitters or hormones, that research write-ups should at least not be bland or dead. Research should feel as though it is alive and in motion, and that the people and organizations behind the research have or had faces and stories to tell to give context and color to what research you are doing. An example of where putting the human face on theoretical arguments received worldwide attention was a research conducted by Tettergy and Hambrick. And in order to study whether CEOs' narcissism is good or bad for a firm, those researchers had to backtrack from just presenting bland data to pique the interest of readers. So they added quotations that provided context. These quotations were the aspect of their research write-up that readers related to the most. They were also quotations that readers had seen in popular press. After grabbing the interest of readers, the theory that the researchers were trying to present now became more interesting and easier to digest. One particular method under the qualitative research approach that drew my attention and that utilizes stories is a narrative inquiry. It's also the method that I'm using in my dissertation. Narrative inquiry uses the stories of participants to understand multi-dimensional meanings of society, culture, human actions, and life. Narrative inquiry uses the process of storytelling to access the life experiences of participants. It is backed up theoretically, and philosophically. It is interpretive research with the complexities of creating an acceptable and accessible research project, and subject to readers' own individual formation, history, experiences, and environment. And this quote is from Dr. Kim, who wrote the textbook that I particularly am using heavily in my dissertation. The heart, I will use one more Jesuit value, which is unity of heart, mind, and soul. The unity of our heart, mind, and our soul, a Jesuit education value, is the unity of a narrative quest. The narrative quest is one of the goals of the narrative inquiry method under the qualitative research approach. And Dr. Kim says that because we understand our own lives in terms of narratives, the lives that we live out, that we share, narrative is appropriate for understanding the actions of others. Therefore, it's appropriate in research. We dream in narratives, we remember in narratives, we anticipate, hope, believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, love, all by narrative. So it should be a credible data source. A narrative is a recounting of events that are organized in a temporal sequence. And this linear organization of events make up a story. The stories of identity, that is the stories of the individuals, how people think about who they are, where they began, what roots they have, and where they are headed. Therefore, storytelling is a powerful tool in a leader's toolbox. Companies are already using these storytelling methods. Here are a few of them on the screen. And if you want to know more about how these organizations are using it, you can also kind of look those up using the reference list at the end. World Bank uses it, IBM, Krispy Kreme, Pfizer, the US Army, Xerox, Harvard Business School, NASA, just to name a few of those. So by no means am I saying that I am an expert in this field, but today I will ask you to consider a story as a legitimate research product. That is the outcome of a research process. So what is your story? What stories are you willing to share with others to motivate them? When was the last time the story of another inspired or motivated you to become a better person or better leader? So at the beginning, I invited you to consider sharing an aspect of this talk that you found useful or an aspect that resonated with you. So if there was something that came to mind, I invite you to share that by just using the raised hand emoji. If there was something that came up that resonated with you or struck you as interesting. Thank you for listening.
I want to raise the hand, but I don't know how.
That's okay. You can just speak. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, what resonated with me is, well, telling stories. That the tradition that you're talking about, that's something that really hits me, because I spent 10 years telling astronomy stories. That was my job, was learning the sky, telling stories about the different constellations, and then, you know, telling stories about the people that went to the moon, and, you know, the stories of just looking up at the sky and wondering. And it's just really interesting to me, because one of my dreams has always been to kind of go to different continents and talk to different people and learn their stories of the sky. And one is, I want to go to South Africa, I want to go to Nigeria and to Egypt and, travel around Africa and get stories and put them all together. And then, write a book or do a video and then go to Japan and then go to China and to do the same thing. So that really resonated with me.
Thank you, Michael.
Mm-hmm. I still don't know how to raise the hand. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Anyone can just start. Anyone can chime in. Was there something that drew your attention? Maybe your story. Have you been able to tell your story?
Things I really like when you started us about the story behind our names. I just love that, And again, I do have two names. Gerard is my first name, and Moses is my second name. And I have stories for those two. I mean, for those two names and everything. And I actually made sure. I mean, I asked my mom all the time. In fact, I that's one question I ask people when I get to know people, or when I want to get to know people. How do you get the name you have? And then boom, stories and what you were saying, and then connections emerges, and connection with a person, just because we tell the stories about our names. So that's really stay with me and very powerful. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you, Dr. Gutierrez.
This is Connie Fuller. You don't have my picture, which is a good thing for you. So I will just speak. I had an experience when I was 18 years old that I don't know that I need to go through the whole experience with you, given our timing, because it's a long story. But it was something that that I did. I was raised in a little town in Missouri where there was no diversity, absolutely none. And I spent my summer after high school working in a church camp, and the church camp was way out in the woods, and it had two sides. And one side was for the white kids who were bused out from St. Louis. It was very nice. There was a big lake. All of the cabins, so to speak, were brick, and they were new, and everything was wonderful. On the other side of the road, back in the woods, was the camp for the African-American children from the city of St. Louis. And they had wooden cabins, and they didn't have a kitchen to cook, to have cooked food like the kids on the other side had. And the contrast was just glaring to me. And I did dishes in the kitchen on the other side, that was my summer job. And I was forbidden, as well as were my other coworkers. We were forbidden to cross the road to go to the other camp. So I have long been a rebel. So as soon as it would get dark, I would go through the woods, and I'd go over to the other side. And those children would be sitting around the campfires, just like what you were showing in your early videos. All of the things that you showed with the African culture, these were children who had probably never been out of St. Louis, but they were doing exactly the same thing. And they were telling stories, and they were laughing, and they were happy. And these are kids that we provided with toothbrushes when they came, because they didn't have any. I mean, the difference between what was going on in that camp and what was going on the white camp was so striking for me that I kept going over there for the whole summer. If anybody ever knew it, they didn't say anything. Nobody turned me in or anything. And I learned so much about African culture and African joy. And I've been going to church since I was a little girl. We don't laugh, and we don't have fun at my church. We just, hear hellfire and damnation. And these kids were so joyous. And I don't think I realized that I was only 18 and I'd never been out of my town. So I don't think I realized the impact that had on me until I was involved in diversity work at one of the colleges where I taught. And we were asked to make a video about, our history with diversity. And boom, I went right back to being 18 years old and told that story and realized how significantly that changed my life. And I'm not kidding. Every aspect of my life changed in that experience. And everything that you said here today about bringing people together, giving them a chance to get to know each other, giving them a chance to talk about who they are. And those are none of the things we do in corporate America in diversity training. It doesn't happen. Takes too much time, costs too much money. But that's where the connections are made. And the reason I learned that was because I did some research with my own students in the other school and asked them if they had friends who were of a different race and how they came to be friends. And you know what they said? They didn't say I went to a diversity program. They said I met them and I liked them and we became friends because we talked to each other and we got to know each other. And it was like all for my, I'm old, I'm retired, I'm an adjunct faculty. I've lived a very long and wonderful life, but this event when I was 18 contributed to that in ways that I can't even describe.
Thank you, Connie.
You're welcome.
Did anything did anything stand out for any of you in any of the videos that you didn't know before?
What I wanted to say is that I think it comes from all the videos that were shared and all that you have been saying, is that as long as you say, when you tell your story, you're also willing to hear other stories. And this goes hand in hand with what Connie just said, that when you hear other stories, you tend to accept and you can listen more and you're willing to learn from other people's stories. And we are all our own story. We cannot be understood without our story. So if you really want to know somebody or the other people that are with you, you need to share and be willing to know their stories. And so I think that is something that stood out to me.
Thank you, Leah.
I got in.
Sorry, Kareem, go ahead. You go first.
Yeah, I got in a little bit late, but one of the things that stood out to me is that storytelling, especially like when we're telling our stories like in groups or in partners and things like that, I think it also builds trust. I think that's the other part of storytelling too. I know that I saw at the end your acronym for story, but in addition to that, when I think about that, I also think about like building trust. And as you build trust, then you can build friendship. And as you build friendship, you can start to work on things together and really start to form a bond individually. But in corporate, world, we're really focused on the job at hand, the task at hand. But if we had the time to tell stories, and really quick, I did a DEI session with a charter school. Don't you know that we did an exercise that said basically, tell us one thing that someone doesn't know about you. And I kid you not, it had to be like 50 or 60 people in there. And they had been working together for at least 6 to 7 months. Folks are like, I didn't know that. Because there wasn't like a space for them to even to be able to do an activity like that until at that point. So, just want to say that's what stood out to me, is that storytelling is a great way to build trust.
Excellent.
That's what I got from it.
Thank you, Kareem. And Elena?
Good for you. Yeah, storytelling. I think it's really cool. So I work in corporate, and every corporate is like on a cool mission. We're gonna make big, great things. And then I like to remind them and say, know your story and know where you're coming from and find your path going forward. And it becomes important, and it's a good reality check of like, hey, it's not the same as the corporate to the left or to the right, and it's know your path. So yeah, storytelling is awesome.
Thank you, Lena. Dr. Gargi.
Thanks, Vivian, for your presentation. That was really illuminating. Like in the video when I think it was a BBC video when they talked about reading Harry Potter, the kids were more accepting of immigrants. Like that's just such, like who would have thought, right? Like you showed some really cool videos as well. So thank you for sharing your work. But just, I've been thinking since you presented, and it made me wonder if the research that students do in the EDD program, if there is a way to talk about that in a story way, so it can reach more people, so it can make changes like the kind we saw in the kids. Because I know as scholar practitioners, all of you want your research to have impact, to change the way people think. And I wonder if there is a way to just talk about things in not just layman terms, but in a way of like, I'm telling you my story, this was my experience. And I would be really interested in seeing how many people that would reach. So I'm glad there's people like you doing research on such a good way of sharing what you're up to. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Gary.
Also, Vivian, I think you mentioned narrative research, and I had a student a couple of years ago who did her whole dissertation using narrative research, and it was fascinating. I mean, she only had 2 participants, but her intent was to compare and contrast and learn what she could from their stories. So everything was told in story form, and it was fascinating and very valid. So.
This is Dr. Grassmeyer, and I'm Vivian's chair. Hello, Vivian. Thanks
Hello,
for
Dr. Grassmeyer.
Yeah, thanks for such a lovely presentation. So one of the things that resonated for me, and to your deep credit, was for those of you who don't know this, she and I have been back and forth a little bit, because I'm stuck in this idea that her paper has to be scholarly, and she keeps saying, but I'm a storyteller. I'm a storyteller. So I really appreciated all of the presentation for that element. And then probably also because I'm not a storyteller. And I think about people in my life who have done such a good job, and who, I can remember stories from my grandmother from when I was 4 and could repeat them, but I can't repeat them. I don't seem to be able to repeat them with the passion that she does or whatever. And so just the basic elements that some of your speakers talked about in terms of, like, am I paying attention to the audience and what would resonate for them? Or am I just, selfishly sharing what I want to share? I really found super helpful. So thank you for the video clips. They added a lot, I thought, and were instructive. So appreciate that.
Thank you, Dr. G.
Is that related to really the presentation, but it's kind of related at the same time. I was actually wondering when you were showing the videos and you're talking, is about how much what I call cell phones and social media, like in Africa. I know you have been living in the States and other countries. I wonder how much is affecting now storytelling, or the power, the popularity of storytelling, because all of these social media and people spending so much time on their phones and their computers. I hope we don't lose it, or something like that.
There are other arts of the storytelling. The digital storytelling is what happens in those Instagrams and TikToks, or the brief moments of the digital stories that people are telling and clipping parts of their lives. So there's a whole new way of telling stories. It's just different when people are sitting around the campfire versus you are on their phone telling your story, but making clips of these 50-minute clips of the day and placing it and sharing that. Also is a different form of storytelling. So it still exists, but it's evolved in kind of a different, in a way.
When one of the things we did at my last school, where I also worked with the diversity committee a lot, I interviewed the students, and I told you what they said. I just was working with this person, and we became friends. So we set up a lunch period. The lunches didn't have any lunch periods, didn't have any classes, and we'd take over a classroom, and we would set up sessions where anybody could come who wanted to, And when they got there, they had to pair themselves up with someone they didn't know, someone who was obviously or appeared that they might have some difference with them, and spend the entire period just telling each other their stories. And so I filled in one day with because we had an odd number of students, and the student who I ended up working with was a young man in a psychology discipline department, different from my own. And he started telling me his story. And, you know, I'm from a farm in Missouri, so I'm thinking, yeah, what are we going to have in common? And he started telling me his story, and my mouth was just hanging open because he could have been telling my story. And on the surface, it looked like we didn't have anything in common. And to your point, with all of this, he and I ended up being friends for the rest of the time that he was working in his program. He's still in Chicago. I see his name in the paper every once in a while for the work he's doing. But it's like magic. I mean, it creates so many good things that, you know, and I have an advantage. I use storytelling in my classes a lot, but I have an advantage because I'm older and everybody's younger than me. So they're always curious about what happened in the olden days, you know, so I can tell them stories about being at work and, you know, just make my points, as you said, Vivian, through the stories that I could tell. So, and I, like you, love to tell stories.
Thank you, Connie. I'm excited to use stories for my research. I'm using two forms of narrative, so words and art. So I'm having my participants not just tell their stories by voice, but by creative expression, tell their stories about leadership. So it should be good, but I'm really diving deep into the idea of narratives and storytelling, and to try to make it something that other people would want to use and see as scholarly way of getting research as well, but also something that other people will pick up and read, and not just go, oh, well, there's a bunch of numbers and a bunch of graphs. How do I just read the conclusion really quick and gloss over all the work?
I wanted to share something. I mean, yeah, I'm from Eastern Africa, so I can relate a lot to what you say in many perspectives. And I also, part of my socialization is what you quoted from the Ignatian values, so I'm part of the order. And starting from the institutional dimension of it, the founder, St. Ignatius of Loyola, there is a very strong way in which his story has shaped the institution. It's really a very strong foundational framework. I mean, I look at the identity of the institution as fundamentally shaped by his autobiography. It is a story of his life. The memory that he shares in his stories, his conversion, his spirituality, his values, that has more force than the legal aspects of what should guide the institution. And then when you talked about the narratives from Africa, I just remembered, I mean, I've lived most of my life. I just came from Africa last year. So I was relating very closely with what you were sharing in terms of going back to whenever I go to the village and I meet my grandmother, my grandfather, the elderly people, and I sit next to them. they tell me stories of the phases of my development. They tell me stories when I was 5 years old, when I was 8, 9 years old, 14 years old. Some I can remember, some not. This is just the last aspect of it, how stories have a very strong impact on our memories. Yeah, so I made the connectivity between the memory, the impact of the stories on our memory, which largely shapes the way we live. And as part of my identity culturally, and also as a religious, there's some kind of an emphasis on paying a lot of attention on what is happening in the imagination. I love doing that. I introspect my imagination and just spend quality time, attending to what is unfolding within the imagination. And the stories that unravel from there give me the insight of many things that guides my scholarly and practitioner work and my memories and many other dimensions of my life. So thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's getting a little late. What do you think, Vivian?
Yes, I really appreciate all of you for attending this, and sorry I went a little bit over. It comes along with inexperience of pulling things together to make it a little bit more
No, it's
compact.
perfect. It's beautiful.
So I do appreciate your time and the contributions and all of that.
That's storytelling. So that's good. No, thank you very much also for taking the time and everything, and to really present to us and to get us even more excited about storytelling and using storytelling in research and in leadership. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody. Thank you everybody for joining us. And then we'll see you in the next JayTalk. Good night. Good night, Vivian.